the increase and open use of recreational and hard drugs, the emergence of the pop culture, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, etc., the questioning of past values and customs. It was a decade that also saw a revolution in the field of transportation, the development of the minicar, the Mini Minor, the Mini Cooper. In Australia and other parts of the world, the dismantling of trolleybus and tram networks. Rail authorities in Australia and UK sadly replacing steam locomotives with impersonal diesel and electric powered units. The introduction of mass travel with Boeing's Jumbo 747 and the experience of international travel at supersonic speed of the Anglo-French Concorde. So the emergence of the container sat quite comfortably within this period of revolutionary zeal. It was part of a global progression towards increased economic benefits and greater efficiencies. It also introduced new words into our vocabulary, such as containerisation, intermodalism, logistics, to name a few. The early days. Reference was made in the film tonight to the American Malcolm McLean, who in 1956 transformed containerisation from a concept into reality. In the early 1960s, whilst a few American shipping lines were introducing containers between Europe and ports on the east coast of North America and other trade lanes, individual British and European lines were carrying out their own research into the introduction of containerisation. All of them came to the same conclusion. No one line had sufficient financial capital to convert their existing services to containerisation with purpose-built tonnage. The answer was for lines to join together to form a consortium. This enabled the raising of sufficient capital and the pooling of their knowledge and know-how to develop and introduce a revolution. The development of the two British consortia. In June 1965, it was announced that 4 long-established British lines had agreed to form a consortium called Overseas Containers Limited, referred to by the acronym OCL. The member lines were P&O, Ocean Transport and Trading, British and Commonwealth Shipping, and Furness Withy. And this development was followed in January 1966 by the establishment of a second British consortium calling itself Associated Container Transportation Limited and referred to as ACT, whose members were made up of another 5 equally long established British lines, Blue Star Line, Cunard, Ellerman Lines, Ben Line and Harrison Line. OCL announced that the first trade they would containerise would be between UK, Europe and Australia, and ACT made a similar announcement shortly afterwards. OCL and ACT soon agreed to launch a joint service consisting of OCL's 6 vessels and ACT's 3 vessels programmed in an integrated schedule with each line sharing slots on each other's vessels. At the time, this arrangement was regarded as groundbreaking. In 1969, the then Australian government-owned Australian National Line, ANL, signed a partnership agreement with ACT and became a partner in this integrated service. ANL also bought one of the ACT vessels, and in so doing, ANL became directly involved in international shipping for the first time. On a personal note, I joined ACT in London in 1968. The frenetic years between 1966 and 1969 saw the development of a shipping revolution in the trade between UK, Europe and Australia. Over the span of these 3 short years, OCL and ACT rewrote the terms of the Bill of Lading to cover door-to-door container movements, introduced computers into the shipping industry for the first time, ordered the construction of thousands of containers, designed and built 9 cellular container ships, each of around 1,300 to 1,500 TEUs. At the time, they were the largest purpose-built cellular container ships in the world, oversaw the construction of container terminals and inland depots in Europe and Australia, investigated the possibility of offering shippers marine insurance, although this project was eventually abandoned, liaise with exporters and importers in reviewing and redesigning their loading and unloading facilities at production plants and warehouses, arrange feeder services by sea and rail in Australia and Europe, trained the consortia's shore-based and sea-going staff, and consulted in Australia and UK with the respective governments and their custom and quarantine agencies, also the union movements, as well as the road and rail providers. Let us now turn to the film itself. The reasons for making this film were fourfold. Firstly, to present a permanent commemoration of the 50th anniversary, which must be considered as one of the major developments in Australian maritime history. Secondly, to highlight the fact that this shipping revolution was successfully introduced along one of the world's longest trade lanes, made much longer at the time by the closure of the Suez Canal after the 1967 Egyptian-Israeli War. Thirdly, to bring to the general public's attention the role played by containerisation today in our everyday lives. And fourthly, to acknowledge the developments in containerisation over the past 50 years. The scale of these developments can be measured by looking at two sets of statistics. In 1969, the global volume of containers handled could have numbered in the hundreds of thousands of TEUs. In 2018, the World Shipping Council statistics indicate that during that year, the 50 major ports in the world handled approximately 480 million TEUs. And with regards to the capacities of container vessels, as I have already mentioned, the first OCL and ACT vessels had a capacity of around 1,300 to 1,500 TEUs. In 2020, container vessels are being built, each with a capacity of up to 24,000 TEUs. My research indicates that there are now over 100 container vessels in the trade between Asia and Europe, each with a capacity of over 20,000 TEUs. The production of the film. Towards the end of 2016, the 50th anniversary looming in 2019, I decided that this milestone had to be commemorated in some way. By chance, one evening in January 2017, I was talking to my next-door neighbour, Tony Ayres, who was also wheeling out his garbage bins in preparation for the council collection the following day. Tony has a wide experience and extensive knowledge in agriculture and food production, and is the executive director of his consultancy company, Rounding Up Proprietary Limited. From that conversation developed our association with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, in Canberra. Tony became my business associate in this venture, and without him, this project would never have got off the ground. And my thanks to Tony is beyond measure. Also in early 2017, I invited John Sparrett, former Managing Director of P&O Containers, Christopher Cullen, former Managing Director of ACT Group, and Frank Needs, a Senior Executive of ANL, to join me in forming a small committee to develop this project. I thank these gentlemen for their support, particularly in the initial stages, which proved so important. At the beginning of 2018, the committee was considering placing advertisements in various newspapers as a way to commemorate the 50th anniversary. But Rod Nairn, CEO of Shipping Australia, was the person who suggested that we forget about advertisements and make a documentary film instead. And I thank Rod for providing me with my light bulb moment. After interviewing a couple of filmmakers, we appointed Jamie Davis, and he in turn introduced us to the film producer, Patrick Lindsay. And I thank Jamie and Patrick for their extraordinary enthusiasm and professionalism in the making of the film World in a Box. The future. Let us now transport ourselves forward in time. The year is 2069, and at the ripe old age of 121 years, I am asked to produce a sequel film to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the first international container service into Australia. Given the speed of technology now and the increased speed we can expect during the next 50 years, you can be sure the global shipping scene in 2069 will be unrecognizable compared to the shipping industry we see today. During the next 50 years, will a visionary like Malcolm McLean appear and introduce us to another revolutionary shipping concept? What will be the effect of digital transformation upon the shipping industry? If there are still container ships plying the trade lanes in 2069, what will be their size? How will they be powered? Will they be totally controlled by robotics? What will be the international trading patterns look like? Will Australia be a major exporter of manufactured goods? Will India be the manufacturing engine room of the world? Will Australia's agricultural exports be dominated by plant-based products instead of meat? Will wool be a fibre of the past? Will the shipping industry become carbon-free by then? But whatever the scene may look like in 2069, we in Australia, as an island nation, will continue to depend on a shipping industry to service our imports and exports that will continue to drive and sustain our economy. In conclusion, my appreciation goes to the Chief Justice of the Federal Court of Australia, His Honour James Allsop, for his support and enthusiasm, not only for the film World in a Box, but also his interest in my book, Homeward Trade. I thank my friend, His Honour Kevin Lindgren, for his support and interest throughout this venture. And finally, my thanks to the President of the Australian Academy of Law, His Honour Alan Robertson, for agreeing to hold this event, and to the Academy's staff for making the necessary arrangements. Thank you.
Might we invite Justice Sarah Derrington to speak.
Thank you, Chief Justice. Good evening, everyone. I too would like to express my thanks to the Honourable Kevin Lindgren and the Honourable Alan Robertson and the Australian Academy of Law for organising this event and inviting me to speak. May I also say how delighted I am to see so many of the maritime community online. I am missing our regular interactions and hope that normal services will resume soon. Now, the topic that I'm going to address this evening is what legal issues might yet need to be resolved and by what mechanism. We've seen through the very interesting film that Martin Orchard is responsible for, which I think should become compulsory on all maritime law curriculum, that the container revolution commenced in the late 1950s and continued apace throughout the latter half of the 20th century. And although the revolution resulted in the rapid development of multimodal carriage, the lingering legal issue is the development of a proper international liability regime for multimodal carriage. There's currently no uniform legal regime governing liability for the multimodal carriage of goods, most usually within a container. Instead, we have a series of single mode regimes, variously concerned with carriage by sea, air, road or rail, and a series of what I describe as multimodal afterthoughts, designed to have the least possible interference with the existing single mode regimes. And examples of these are COTIF and CMR. Now, the issue lingers because neither the Hague nor the Hague-Visby rules, which remain the primary liability regime for the carriage of goods by sea, were drafted with containerisation in mind. There are only two references to containers in the Hague-Visby rules, one in Article 6, capital A, in relation to deck cargo, and one in Article 4, Rule 5C, the limitation provisions. These afterthoughts mean there's been continuing jurisprudential conflict as to whether a container is the package or unit for the purposes of limitation of liability, or whether it depends on the way packages and units are enumerated on the bill of lading as packed. By the time of the promulgation of the Hamburg Rules in 1978, containers were, as you've heard, an ordinary part of maritime transport, yet they garnered little attention in the new rules. They were included within the definition of goods, if supplied by the shipper, and Article 6, Rule 2A attempted to clarify the meaning of the shipping unit, which would be the basis of limitation of liability, although still using the words that have proven controversial, enumerated in the bill of lading as packed. And the El Greco case is our most famous example of that controversy. Now, early in the container revolution, standard form contracts and associated trade practices were developed by industry in an attempt to solve the most difficult the most common difficulties faced by multimodal transport operators. These included the FIATA Multimodal Transport Bill of Lading, the UNCTAD ICC rules for multimodal transport documents, and CombiDoc. More recently, a suite of negotiable and non-negotiable multimodal transport documents was developed, including BIMCO's Multidoc 95, the CombiCon Bill, and the CombiCon Way Bill. Now, these documents provide for a more or less complete contractual liability regime with clear rules on issues such as the basis of liability, availability of defences in different stages of the voyage, limitation, and a time bar. What each of these documents is concerned to address, each in a different way, is how to avoid interference with mandatory regimes applicable to unimodal segments of the adventure. And as Professor Lorenzen observes, this is where the difficulty lies. Whilst attempts have been made at multimodal thinking, those attempts are all set within the framework of the various unimodal regimes, all of which are negotiated with the parties concerned and which are designed to tackle the specific needs of specific unimodal carriage. There's no need for a perils of the sea defence in relation to those driving a truck. Similarly, a per package or unit limitation makes no sense in relation to carriage by air. In 1980, there was an attempt at an international convention with the United Nations Convention on International Multimodal Transport of Goods, but that did not attract any significant support. In part, it's said because of the adverse lobbying by the maritime industry. The convention provided for the possibility of issuing one document, the MT document, to cover the entire transportation period, and for the multimodal transport operator to undertake the liability of the whole period during which it is in charge of the goods, being from the time it takes the goods into its charge until the time of delivery. The most recent attempt at a more comprehensive liability regime was the promulgation of the Rotterdam Rules in 2008. They were intended to replace the Hague-Visby and the Hamburg rules, and therefore are premised on a unimodal regime. Nevertheless, they were designed as a multimodal regime, provided there is a sea carriage leg, and therefore they are referred to as a maritime plus regime. This approach makes the convention applicable to the sea leg, and where the contract provides for a further leg through a different mode of transport to that extra leg. It attempts to resolve issues of conflict of conventions through provisions aimed at creating a limited network liability system. This means that it will apply the unimodal regime applicable to a specific mode of transport in all circumstances in which the event which has caused loss or damage or delay has been localised, provided such event is the exclusive cause of the loss, damage or delay. Where damage is not localised, then the Rotterdam Rules apply. Now, these rules have not achieved international support. As at the 8th of May this year, there were 25 signatories who together comprise 25% of the world's trade, but only 5 state parties: Benin, Cameroon, Congo, Spain, and Togo. So consequently, particular problems remain when goods are carried at sea in containers, and these problems are not adequately addressed by the existing liability regimes. Despite the lack of support for the adoption of the Rotterdam Rules by states, proponents of the rules themselves continue to advocate for their adoption, particularly by reference to the perceived benefits with respect to containerised cargo. Uncertainty around the package limitation is unlikely to be resolved definitively by the Rotterdam Rules, since the wording is largely unchanged from that used in the Hague and the Hague-Visby rules. The Rotterdam Rules do attempt to address issues around deck cargo, liability for which can be excluded entirely by the carrier under the Hague and the Hague-Visby regimes, by creating a mini regime regarding liability for cargo actually carried on deck. And they deal with 3 issues. Is carrying cargo on deck a breach of contract in itself? Is the carrier liable for loss of or damage to and delay in delivery of permitted deck cargo? And is the carrier's liability for loss of, damage to and delay in delivery of non-permitted deck cargo subject to limitation? The Rotterdam Rules would also dramatically alter the obligations of the carrier in requiring it before, at the beginning, and during the voyage by sea to exercise due diligence to make and keep the holds and all other parts of the ship in which the goods are carried, and importantly, any containers supplied by the carrier, fit and safe for their reception, carriage, and preservation. One of the issues which may be assisted by the adoption of the Rotterdam rules is the increasing number of casualties caused by container fires in recent years. The Sincerity Ace, the Yantian Express, the APL Vancouver, and the Grande America. The principal source of the underlying problems that led to these tragedies was the non-declaration or misdeclaration of the dangerous nature of the cargoes. Unlike the Hague and the Hague-Visby rules, the Rotterdam rules include a substantial number of provisions that encourage relevant parties to communicate and share information about goods for carriage, as well as enumerating the liabilities of parties when they fail to do so. They also provide a legal underpinning for the parties' use of electronic communication, including electronic transport records, which could include the use of blockchain, thereby facilitating the sharing of relevant information relating to the goods the subject of the carriage. Both the IMO Subcommittee on Carriage of Cargoes and Containers and the IMO Facilitation Committee, meeting in February of this year, have acknowledged the role that the Rotterdam rules would play in reducing the risk of container fires by requiring greater sharing of information between shippers and carriers and facilitating electronic commerce, which will better enable operational personnel to have timely access to the information needed to ensure vessel safety. Important though these issues are, they are raised primarily in the context of maritime carriage, although no doubt safety issues also arise during transport by other modes, although perhaps with less catastrophic consequences. So we return to the initial observation that there is no one international liability regime for multimodal carriage of goods. Rather, there is a complex web of unimodal regimes, and the Rotterdam rules will not change this position. There is, of course, a threshold question, and that is whether there is in fact a need for a compulsory legal regime for multimodal transport, or whether the current contractual framework for multimodal transport produces unfair results. Again, Professor Lorenzen suggests that the current framework does not appear to have created particularly harsh or unfair results for cargo interests. He observes that the market for multimodal carriage is not as concentrated as it is for single-mode transport operations, and that competition among different players has not offered fertile soil for the development of dubious exclusion clauses. He posits that the only way to achieve a truly multimodal regime must be that of taking a firm multimodal approach, by which he suggests looking to the container itself as the single mode of transport. It might then be possible to design a special regime applicable to containerised carriage. Alternatively, freedom of contract might yet produce the best solutions for all those involved in a rapidly developing industry underpinned by the technological advances that Martin has alluded to and that we are yet to imagine. Containerisation has also had implications for other doctrines of maritime law, such as general average. Natalie Campbell, in her most recent book, has observed that the modern reality of container vessels that carry tens of thousands of containers, with potentially more than one bill of lading attributed to a single container, and multiple holders of those bills of lading, makes the adjustment of general average complex and practically difficult. Although provision is made in the York-Antwerp Rules 2016 for particular cargo to be excluded from contributing to general average if the cost exceeds the eventual contribution, smaller packages may still be of sufficient value to negate Rule 17A2, resulting in an exorbitant number of contributors remaining. Her conclusion is that the York-Antwerp rules may not be an appropriate mechanism to deal with general average arising from today's container vessels. That's for others to debate, but all of these matters show that the continuing impacts of containerisation on the principles of maritime law, which were formulated long before the world could be carried around in a box. Thank you very much.
Just
Right,
Stuart.
over to me. So the presentations thus far have considered the revolution in maritime transport that containerisation has brought about and the international legal developments spawned by that revolution. And this final presentation will consider the effects that containerisation has had on a typical shipping transaction. The sale of goods and their shipping by sea to their destination comprises a multiplicity of legal relationships, each governed by its own unique contractual arrangements. I will consider the container revolution's impact on 4 of these relationships. First, on the contract of sale itself. Second, on the contract of carriage, evidenced by the bill of lading. Third, on the chartering of the ship. And finally, on the insurance contracts for the carriage of the goods. I turn now to the relationship between seller and buyer, governed by the contract of sale. Sale contracts in a shipping context are commonly made on Incoterms, standard rules published by the International Chamber of Commerce. These were first promulgated in 1936 and have been amended 9 times since then. Some of the most significant changes to Incoterms have resulted from containerisation. The most common sale terms in an international trade context include FOB, free on board, and C&F, cost and freight, or CIF, cost insurance freight. Although under FOB terms, the buyer arranges and pays for the sea carriage, and under C&F and CIF terms, the seller has that responsibility. Under all these terms, the risk passes from the seller to the buyer when the goods pass the ship's rail. The obvious implication of containerisation is that the shipper loses practical control over the cargo when it is placed inside a container, which is then sealed and handed over to a carrier for loading. Typically, the container may be stacked for some time in the possession of the carrier or even an intermediate freight forwarder before being loaded and passed over the ship's rail. Under FOB and CNF terms, during this period, the seller remains at risk. In the case New South Wales Leather Company and Vanguard Insurance Company in 1991, the New South Wales Court of Appeal was required to deal with some of these issues, including with whether the use of containers changes when risk would pass in a sale on FOB terms. The Brazilian shipper had loaded a cargo of leather into containers and caused the containers to be delivered to the carrier. However, at some stage before loading in Brazil, the goods were stolen from the container. The buyer invited the court, obviously here in New South Wales, to find that as a result of what is described as was described as the container revolution, the time at which risk passed had changed, and that goods intended for shipment should be regarded as shipped when they are loaded into a container and the container is sealed. A majority of the court, Justices of Appeal Handley and Clark, rejected the argument and affirmed that an FOB contract clearly defines risk as passing when the goods pass over the ship's rail. The container revolution had not revolutionized FOB terms. Kirby P. preferred not to answer that question because the case could be decided on a different issue. However, with reference to US Supreme Court authorities, Honour suggested that the container might be regarded as a modern substitute for the hold of a vessel, with the result that risk would pass on the goods being stowed into the container. Changes have been made in later iterations of the Incoterms to address issues with FOB terms arising from the use of containers. These include the introduction of FCA, free carrier, which makes the seller responsible for delivery of the goods to the custody of the carrier at a named place, whereafter risk passes to the buyer, and FAS, free alongside ship, where the seller is responsible for delivering the goods within reach of the ship's tackle, whereafter risk passes to the buyer. These terms are intended for use where parties seek the risk to pass from the seller on delivery of the container to the carrier or to a place rather than on loading onto the vessel. Notably, Incoterms 2000 contains a strong warning that FOB terms should not be used when the parties do not intend delivery across the ship's rail, such as where the seller delivers a container for subsequent loading onto the vessel. Next, let us consider the contract of carriage that is evidenced by the bill of lading. The goods for carriage may be sufficient to warrant their own container, so the seller may contract with the ocean carrier on an FCL, that is full container load basis, and the bill may be a multimodal bill utilized where one or more legs of carriage are on land. But the goods may not require their own container, so the seller may contract with a freight forwarder or NVOCC, non-vessel owning or operating common carrier, on an LCL basis, that is less than a full container load. The NVOCC will consolidate the goods with the goods of other shippers and issue a house bill of lading to each. It will then contract as shipper with the ocean carrier to carry the container, and the ocean carrier will issue to it a bill of lading in which it, and not the seller, will be reflected as shipper. A container bill of lading will generally be a received for shipment bill rather than a shipped on board bill. The difference is important. For example, a CIF buyer need not accept a received for shipment bill of lading. Also, if the carrier does not pack the container, then it will be unable to issue a bill of lading recording the apparent good order and condition of the goods, which gives a purchaser, and in particular an on-purchaser, less assurance that what is loaded in the container is what was bought, or that it is in apparently good condition. This may also have implications for any financing arrangement, including whether the terms of a letter of credit have been met, such as to trigger payment. A key impact of containerisation, as Justice Derrington said, on bills of lading has been in respect of package limitation. The Hague-Visby rules limit the liability of a carrier based on the number of packages or units enumerated in the bill of lading as packed in the container. Where goods are shipped in a container, whether the container itself, as opposed to each package stowed in the container, is the package or unit, can significantly impact the limit of the carrier's monetary liability. The law in Australia and England on this point has now diverged. In El Greco, in a judgment by Justice Alsop in 2004, the full court of the Federal Court held that unless the number of units or package as packed was enumerated on the bill of lading, the container would be the package. In Kikuyu Co. Limited and A.P. Moller-Maersk in 2018, the English Court of Appeal held that if the number of units in the container was enumerated, even if that was not described on the bill of lading as packed, each unit would be a package for the purposes of limitation. Turning now to the chartering arrangements, the contractual carrier under a bill of lading is often not the owner of the vessel. It could be any one of a number of charterers. The chartering relationships have become somewhat more complicated with containerisation. In particular, containerisation has led to the widespread use of slot charter parties. A slot charter is an agreement to make available a part of a vessel's cargo carrying capacity. The characterization of slot charters as charter parties, properly so called, has sparked some controversy, but the better view, in my view that is that they are charter parties. There is a debate as to whether a slot charter is merely an example of a voyage charter for part of a ship, or a sui generis type of charter that bears features of both time and voyage charters. Containerization and the use of slot charter parties, as Martin indicated, has led to liner conferences whereby companies coordinate their liner shipping services and agree freight rates. By this means, a particular line can offer frequent and regular sailings on an advertised route, even though only its share of those sailings will be undertaken by ships operated by it, the others being undertaken by the other members of the conference. Special provision is made for liner conference agreements in Part 10 of the Competition and Consumer Act. Turning finally now to the insurance arrangements, containerization has also had implications for insurance to protect against damage to goods during carriage. The Marine Insurance Act of 1909 requires the insured to have an insurable interest as defined in Section 11 of the Act. Referring back to the New South Wales leather case, it turned on whether the buyer had an insurable interest in the goods. As the leather was loaded in the containers but not shipped, with risk not having passed under the FOB sale, the buyer did not have an insurable interest in the goods at the relevant time and would have been unable to claim under the policy were it not for a lost or not lost clause. The case has been described as an illustration of the continuing difficulty in modern times in relation to the requirement of an insurable interest. It was discussed by the Australian Law Reform Commission in its review of the Marine Insurance Act in 2001. The ALRC identified that containerization made it more difficult to establish where damage or loss to goods took place, which affected the inquiry whether an insured had an insurable interest at the time of the loss. The Commission observed that broadly it may be argued that in view of cargo containerisation, the law should deem containers to be functionally part of the ship, so that loading into the container should generally be considered as the point of delivery at which risk in the goods passes. Nonetheless, the Commission did not recommend any relevant amendment to the Act, preferring the issue to be resolved contractually, and noting that one view is that FOB terms should not be so commonly used 35 years, as it then was, after the widespread introduction of containerisation. The additions to Incoterms discussed above seek to address this. In conclusion, it can be observed that containerisation has had a significant impact on the legal relationships involved in the carriage of goods by sea. As with the international legal framework, the domestic legal ramifications of the container revolution continue to arise for resolution.
Thank you, Justice Stewart. May I say a few words about the topic? If I could possibly have put on the screen a photograph which I found in my papers recently. There it is. That's the 2nd of December, 1937, taken by Sydney Morning Herald photographers, Fairfax Photos, and that's unpacking dates at Woolloomooloo. And from that, you can see much of what we've been discussing. You can see the hard manual labour, you can see the package limitation, and you can see in the eyes of the young man the risk of theft. Thank you. So it's no defamation. The time Martin began his life in shipping was at a time of great change in the shipping industry and world transport. As Martin's CV and as the film showed, it was still the age, certainly for Australian transport and shipping transport and much of the world transport, of the great influence of the British ship-owning interests in transport. And as Mr. McLean's endeavours in the 1950s showed that the United States of America was, after the war, as it still is, an important trading nation, although its shipping capacity, like British, has decreased in relation to other countries. But what it does show is the change that was wrought between cargo and ship in terms of how goods were to be both legally and physically carried. Justice Derrington referred to the Visby Amendments in 1967 and the case and the package limitation that has spawned, unfortunately, disagreement between intermediate courts of appeal in Australia and England now. But there's a fascinating story about containers within that Visby Convention that led to the Hague-Visby rules. It can be found in the Journal of Maritime Commerce, the American Maritime Journal, written by the American negotiators. There was a clash of commercial and shipping culture at the Visby conference about containers and about how the limitation of liability would be determined. It almost led to the failure of any agreement about anything in Visby. Such were the differences, and the differences were largely between the British and the Americans. One Sir Kenneth Diplock, then Lord Justice of Appeal, a man of clear mind and firm views, was the chair of the drafting committee. And the drafting committee and the was charged with the responsibility, of course, of reducing to writing the the agreements of the convention. It looked as though nothing would be agreed. The American delegation insisted on, in its version of the limitation provision, that the container would be viewed as part of the ship, just as President Kirby, in a sense, talked about in the case Justice Stewart referred to. The British, on the other hand, would have none of that, and the container was the package that was put on the ship. And into the very last night, they disagreed. This story was told by the American negotiator, who the following morning at the plenary session was sitting up the back of the room. And in the very last session, the evening beforehand, Sir Kenneth Diplock came to the final negotiations of the committee and said that the British delegation would accept the wording of the American delegation. This came as a great surprise, but great joy to the Americans, who no doubt celebrated. And the next day, at the plenary session of the conference, the chair of the drafting committee availed himself of the privilege that was given to such office as to speak to the agreed wording. And when he came to the drafting convention, he noted the agreement and then thought it would be helpful if he explained the intent of the drafting committee by the wording. His oral explanation of that was entirely in accordance with the British position. Thus, the moral of the story is always beware of the chair of the drafting committee's explanation in the travaux preparatoires. But it did highlight and it was the crux of the difficulty we now face with the interpretation of that article. The container also shows, in a sense, it's been part of the, if I may use the expression, the bulking up of transport, with containerisation and computerisation leading to these huge vessels carrying up to 20,000 TEUs. We have the numbers of shipping lines reducing into these huge conglomerates of Europe and Asia largely, thereby changing the face completely of shipping, but also giving the capacity of small places like Malta to be transit ports for vast acreages of tens of thousands of containers where they can be stored safely and moved at the appropriate time. It's been a fascinating session. I would like to add my thanks to Kevin Lindgren and Alan Robertson for organising this. My special thanks to Martin Orchard for being happy to participate in this format, and to, of course, Justices Derrington and Stewart for their insightful and scholarly short papers. And I think we have some time, plenty of time, to take questions and have a discussion. Now,
if anybody has any questions, you can use the chat facility within Microsoft Teams, and you can type those there, and we'll manage the questions from our end.
Perhaps while that's happening, I might ask Martin a question. What, Martin, in your view, have been the main changes since the introduction of containerisation? Obviously, that was a radical change. Have there been any other major changes in that time, or has it been development of the first idea?
It's really been the development of the first idea. The size of the containers have remained the same, basically. The height's gone up to 9 foot or 9'6" in some places, but basically it's remained the same. It's the speed that containerisation was accepted that I think surprised every one of us who were involved in it. I mean, you take the Australian to Europe trade, by about 1972-73, at least 40% of the northbound trade to Europe was containerised. And then by 1975, over 70%. So it was the speed and how other trades were containerised in pretty quick succession when they realised the savings to be made as a shipper, particularly with pillage and damage being avoided through containerisation. At the time, many shippers thought that they would see their freight rates reduced because of containerisation. I don't know whether that actually happened, but what it did was to slow down the spiral of increasing costs. And I think one had to take a holistic view when to add in the cost of no damage or no pillage to your cargo. So I think that was a big development at the time. And I think the actual development, the statistics that I mentioned during my presentation, I think quite firmly demonstrates just what has happened in the last 50 years. It's been quite extraordinary.
Martin, someone's followed up with a question there saying, would the refrigerated container also represent a big change in shipping?
Well, the refrigerated container was a big part of the startup with Australia, because obviously a large part of northbound trade to Europe from Australia is meat and fruit and dairy. So the refrigerated container was always part of the trade. The refrigerated container sort of developed further with controlled atmosphere containers, which weren't exactly, they were in refrigerated containers, but they changed the system so that the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide, CO2, could be adjusted on the voyage. So you got particularly the fruit that were carried in these containers, or are carried in these containers, the ripening can be controlled during transit. And when you get fragile fruits like blueberries and avocados, then they can be picked in Australia, put in a controlled atmosphere container, and by the time they get to their destination, they're ready for market. So that was a development within the sort of refrigerated container situation. The other, I suppose, development was the integrated reefer container as well. When we started, it was what we call blown air. The ship itself actually had a refrigerated system, and the blown air was connected to the system when the reefer container was put on board. And then the development was the integral container, which has its own unit attached to the one end of the container. And that really now is the reefer container. The blown air container has now, I think, probably all disappeared.
It's another question, Martin, about congestion at Sydney Port, Port Botany. What's the view regarding possible redress against relevant parties? I mean,
Well, look, I have to say, I am not involved nowadays in the day-to-day management of shipping, so I am not in a position to answer that question.
but the question of it raises the issue of how the huge volume of cargo
Yes.
in rapid,
Yes.
and the fact that it only takes
Yes.
an evening to unload.
The knock-on effect is huge. The thing that I note nowadays is how often do we hear about unrest on the Australian waterfront? Not very often, which is fantastic. In the 70s and 80s, it was an everyday occurrence. Half my job at one stage, I was supposed to be a trade manager. Half my job seemed to be diverting containers from one Australian port to another to avoid an unrest on the waterfront. In fact, in ACT, and I'm sure with other shipping companies, we sent a daily telex in those days, email, to our offices in New York, because we had a service to America, we had a service to Europe. We used to send an email to those respected officers with the unrest on the Australian waterfront and how it's affecting our vessels. And that went every day. I wish we'd kept the emails because it made a fascinating book now. But one day in the 1980s, there was no unrest on the Australian waterfront. And the person who composed these emails said, there is no unrest, operations normal, or something like that. And our New York and London officers framed that email.
What do you think? Do you think that the rapid uptake of containerisation was one of the influences on the organisation? What the expression I used was the bulking up of the shipping, the carrying industry. What part did containerisation play in that process of organisation of shipping lines for carriage of goods?
Well, the organisation had certainly in the Australian to Europe trade had already been done with the formation of the consortiums in Britain. That was very closely followed by the European lines. The Germans, Hapag-Lloyd, the Dutch, the French, and the Italians. They came into this trade to Europe from Australia with 5 of their own vessels, and then they formed another consortium, a big consortium, with the ACT OCL services. That was one side of it. The other side of the other concept in those days was through the Scandinavian lines, because they introduced into the Australian to Europe trade the roll-on, roll-off vessels. They went sort of slightly different direction, and they had, for instance, a lot of paper coming from Finland, which you couldn't put in container. Their rolls were so big, and other types of cargo that wouldn't suit the cellular container ship. So they went for roll-on, roll-off containers. That was a sort of different development, but that was the development within the UK, well, the Australian to UK Europe trade. And from there, I mean, as I've said in my presentation, once ACT and OCL approved that containerisation worked even along the longest trade lane in the world, one of them anyway, in the world, then that was the indication to other groups that they could do their own thing. So within 1972, the trade between Europe and the Far East, Southeast Asia, was introduced and containerised. Very big trade. In those days, they had 3,500 TEU vessels. They started very big. ACT and Columbus Line started a trade from Australia and New Zealand to the east coast of North America. There's a roll-on, roll-off service introduced on the west coast of the USA. And Australia to Japan was another trade, Australia to Southeast Asia. All this happened by 1975 and 76. By the end of the 1970s, a very large part of the world trade had been containerised.
Another question. Will the consolidation in the industry and the reduction in the number of shipping lines
With the consolidation.
With the consolidation, sorry, mean that the conference system is still relevant and necessary?
Well, conferences have all disappeared through legislation and reviews and what have you. Up to this year, there's always been a question about the capacity. Because there's no conference, the lines can't get together, they can't collude, it can't be seen to be colluding. And the only thing they have are these slot charter agreements, and they're allowed through the various regulatory authorities around the world. But even that has come under question this year with the European Commission reviewing that arrangement, that block exemption. Whether they're still relevant, I don't think they would be allowed. They would be viewed nowadays as collusion. I think the regulatory bodies are very sensitive to this, and I can't see conferences coming back. In the last few months, particularly on the trade between Asia and Europe, you've seen a very large number of sailings cancelled by the various lines. And they've done that completely unilaterally, obviously they're not allowed to discuss it with anybody else. But what they've done is, by quickly acting, by reducing the number of sailings in view of the reduced volume because of the virus, first in China, huge manufacturing, and then in Europe, the huge demand area, what has happened is that in fact the freight rates have been maintained. In fact, in some areas they've actually increased a little bit over the last few months. But that's because the lines have taken their own action in a very quick way. I think, frankly, conferences, having spent most of my life at conference meetings and being part of a conference, really, I think they're a thing of the past.
I thought the film was fascinating in the perspective that it gave to, if I may use the expression, deep landside issues. That is, the producers of goods, perhaps thousands of miles, hundreds or thousands of miles from coastal transport hubs, are able actually to prepare their goods for sea transport.
Yes.
In a sense, in their own environment, by having the container being able to be packed close to their point of production.
Yes.
Whether it's primary production or secondary production, whether it's in somewhere in the middle of China or the middle of Australia, you can actually get your container packed to be unloaded in Shanghai or Europe or Rotterdam. That seems to me to be at the, not just at the transport level, but at the manufacturing level.
Yes. Yes.
The heart of
yes.
globalised trade.
That's right. I think it's one of the great benefits of containerisation, this intermodalism and the ability to transport through various transport hubs and concepts.
And I mentioned Malta. I remember I was in Malta a few years ago and was taken to the port. And of course, Malta is halfway between Sicily and North Africa. And the Maltese have, through their very well organised and safe, well-run port, have created a huge warehouse without a building, which is, I forget how many hectares of open space with all these containers stacked as in an entrepot, which is in effect a vast warehouse.
Yeah. Yes.
Safely storing goods for transport to or from North Africa, to or from Sicily and the markets in Europe through Italy.
Yep.
It was really fascinating.
Yes. The other port in the Mediterranean is Algeciras in southern Spain. That's another big transship port for the Mediterranean destinations within in the Mediterranean.
See, there's another question.
Another question. Will this growth in and reliance on containers give too much power to shipping lines in support of international trade?
A few years ago, there was something like 20-odd container shipping lines trading around the world, and now it's down to about 9. And this is all the rationalisation of the container industry. I suppose it comes down to supply and demand. The rationalisation's been going on now since the 1980s, 1990s. And of course, the smaller number of container ships you've got, they've still got to live that an increasing, in some cases, an increasing amount of cargo. So one could say, well, yes, that gives them the power, if that's the right word. But if there's going to be any increase in shipping lines, I'd very much doubt it, unless some government somewhere decides to pour billions of dollars into their own national shipping line, because I don't think you're going to see much private investments into shipping. It's never been an exactly speculative sort of industry. And of course, shipping is a long-term, has always been a long-term view. You build a ship for 20 years, maybe even 30 years. I don't think it gives the power. I think that's just how the market has changed over the last 10, 20 years.
Have we reached the capacity of the size of the ships that? Because I started with some good friends and colleagues, started to seriously teach maritime law back in 2004, 2005.
Yes.
When the container vessels, people were talking about building 12 and 13,000 TEUs, and most of them were 5, 6, and 7,000. Now they're nearly 20.
Yes.
Vast vessels.
The actual order book for container ships, as we speak, is the lowest for about 15 years, I believe. Hyundai Merchant Marine, the South Korean government-backed shipping line, is now taking, as we speak, 12 24,000 TEUs vessels, and they're building 8 16,000 TEU vessels for delivery next year. And the French group CMA CGM are building 9 23,000 TEUs vessels, and they're going to be powered by, all of them going to be powered by liquid natural gas, LNG. After that, I think the general feeling is that there's going to be a bit of a pause, and there's good reason, of course, because the question is, in my mind anyway, and I think in other people's mind, is, well, what's going to be the effect on globalization with the ongoing trade dispute between China and USA? And also, there's two questions. What is going to be the finality and the effect of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative? And until and if those two questions can be answered, I think maybe the shipping lines will just take a pause from their huge retonnaging over recent years before they sort of decide what they're going to do. And in fact, who knows, maybe the next phase of shipbuilding will incorporate the new technology of power, how you power these container ships, how robotic they become, etc. Because I think that's going to be with us sooner than probably we imagine, sort of within the next decade. So I think there will be a pause now. If for argument's sake, if there was a change in world trade because of those one or both factors, then yes, we might see the end of globalization as we now see it. And trade may become more regional, sort of inter-Asia, inter-Europe, inter-Americas, rather than the interconnection of globalization. But look, that's my view. Other people may not agree.
There's a factor I would take it would be trying to predict what environmental regulation there may
That's
be.
becoming a big issue now in container shipping. I mean, from the 1st of January this year, all ships, or not just container ships, all ships, bulk ships, tankers, the whole lot, they had to reduce their emissions, their sulfur emissions, from 3.5% of emissions to 0.5% of emissions. And that's been a huge change, huge expenditure for the industry. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars just to convert the ships to scrubbers or to take on the lighter oil. So that's one phase of it. I mean, the other phase, of course, is carbon free, and some of the larger shipping lines have got an objective now to be carbon free by 2050. Within the last week, there's been talk in the EU about international maritime shipping being part of their environmental system, whether they include international shipping into their international environmental, and that's causing a bit of a ripple now being debated. Whether it should in fact not be the EU, but it should be left to the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, which already has committees looking at this internationally. So in fact, the argument is if there's any tax to be implied or introduced into shipping for the emissions, it should be done on an international scale, not on a regional scale, because you're going to have different...
Or at a flag scale.
Yes, or the flag scale, yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, there don't seem to be any more questions. I think there is one more question, a late question.
What are your views on introducing regulations and penalties on shippers for misdeclaration of container contents and/or inappropriate, inadequate packing of potentially dangerous goods in containers, e.g. broadly equivalent to an IMDG type code?
Yes, it is a most serious situation, this misdeclaration of dangerous goods. There's really two factors. There's one that is the mistake, and one that is the intentional misdeclaration. And in the last 3 to 4 years at least, there's been, as Her Honour said earlier, there's been some serious fires at sea and loss of life of crew for fighting fires.
And it also affects the vessel, the loading plan. I mean,
Oh yes,
the loading plans of these 20,000 TEU must be
enormous. I mean, it's almost an art form. I mean, you know, always has been with container ships. Somebody declares, you know, they book hazardous cargo. There's a certain area of the ship on deck, away from the accommodation, that you put it. It needs extra paperwork. It needs extra surveillance. You know, in the terminal, you've got to stow them in the terminal at a certain point, a special way away from everything else. All this goes on, and this adds the cost. That's why there's an increase in freight rates for dangerous goods, as well as all the other costs. So it is, you know, it's got to be treated properly. Now, one of the problems is that all this paperwork, there are code numbers, code letters, and when you have a human factor into that, there's always going to be mistakes. And the sooner that all this paperwork is digitalized, it will at least prevent or reduce, hopefully, the incidence of mistakes being made with hazardous cargo. As far as intentional misdeclaration, yes, some lines, most lines, I believe, have introduced heavy penalties on shippers who are found. In fact, one or two of the major lines contracted independent surveyors in various parts of the world who had the authority to actually stop a container at any part of the journey on land and demand that container be opened to check that what the bill of lading said in that container, the packaging corresponded to that description. Because this has become really serious. And in fact, about 3 years ago, the global insurer organizations worked out that there was a fire at sea on board a container ship, one fire every 60 days.
Well, I think that's probably an appropriate time. On all your behalves, I thank the 4 speakers for their individual most interesting presentations, contributing to a very stimulating whole. The Academy will soon, I think, have available on its website a recording of the event. That's the aim. So have a look at the website in a few days if you wish to have access to what you've heard. So thank you again to the speakers. Thank you all for attending, and that concludes this evening's event.
Thanks very much, Alan.